Thank you, Rodney. I appreciate that introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, even though it's probably true I didn't have much of a choice to talk with this program. But sincerely appreciated the offer and the opportunity. And thank you, Rodney, for organizing this year's long events. It's quite an endeavor. I knew that Rodney would take this and run with it like he does so many other things, and I think he's done a wonderful job. So congrats to Rodney. Yeah. And while we're on the topic, none of this would have been possible without you all. I know many of you have supported this series all year long, and I think a little bit of thanks goes out to you too, and thanks for being here today. So give yourself a round of applause. Okay. So Rodney introduced the topic of this year-long endeavor, and as you listen to him talk, you realize how simple it really is. There's really not much to say on it. Doesn't take long to think about it. You just throw together a talk and you go up there. That wasn't my experience. This has been it really cuts to the core of what I've tried to do and hope to do in my research and my teaching. So it was invigorating, but it was quite overwhelming as well, trying to figure out how to tackle this. I hope what I've done today you'll find interesting. I hope it makes sense, and more importantly, I hope I get done on time. So keep me moving. One of my strengths is not to stay on track at all times. If you've ever taken a class from me, you'll know that. So I'm going to try to stay pretty close to my talk so that I can get done. And I'm wedded to this computer because I don't have a remote and I have PowerPoint and I have to push a button a number of times. So a little bit of background about me. Rodney did a pretty good job. But when I went to grad school, I think I got another slide for you. When I went to grad school, I really wanted to pursue questions of the human self. I didn't know a lot about it. Probably thought I knew more than I did. But I was really interested in understanding what the human being is all about, and of course, what the human being in a social environment is all about. I thought initially, and I still think, that one of the ways to explore that is by studying religion. But I was also very interested in sort of the natural base of humans. What is it about us that makes us the same? What is it about our biology and our history and our evolution that makes us human, that our culture and our society has to respond to? I chose the social sciences, anthropology specifically, but in my endeavors to answer some of these questions and to learn what other people said about them and to conduct research on them, I've covered a lot of fields, probably too many. One of the things that happens is you don't get in the depth that you would like, but psychology, sociology, anthropology, evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology, cultural psychology, a whole realm of fields, cultural studies, that I've kind of looked into, found lots of resonance, of course, and lots of overlap, but places that I went to try to find some knowledge and to put together some thoughts about these things. As I develop my interest in human selves and essentially human communities, I'm getting behind on my slides. One of the things that I started studying and thinking about that I want to kind of focus on today is this tension between, what did I put up there, individualness and collectiveness. I think this cuts to the core of human communities. I think it cuts to the core of the human self. I think it cuts to the core of what we are as people, as human beings. I think the challenge of balancing this individualness and collectiveness, there's all sorts of terms you could put up there for those, and I sort of made a last-minute decision to go with these two, but you could use a whole series of dichotomies, and part of my research studies was about the ways that people talk about the human self cross-culturally. And there's all sorts of dichotomies that people put together. I tend to not think of a dichotomy as much as a tension, because I think these two things are very core. As think I've said, but maybe not, this tension has to be mediated culturally. Human beings are dependent on cultures and adaptation. Somehow we have to do this, and somehow it has to be mediated to form a group and sustain a group. I'm going to say right now, and you can argue with me, that I think, and not at the moment, but argue with me afterwards, that these things represent human needs. I think there's a need for individualness or individual awareness and a need for some kind of collective interaction, cooperation. I think there's lots of evidence for that. I also think that it poses an ongoing challenge to human community. And I think that both of these, this negotiating this tension or mediating this tension or working out this tension is often directed at some kind of common good. I think a community has to be directed at some common good. That doesn't mean that the benefits of community are distributed equally. We have lots of knowledge that they're not, but nonetheless they're directed at some common good. And that's been a consistent theme in my work and my collaborations with others, is how do we direct our work towards some common good? And of course the wheel. So I got to get back to the wheel because Rodney provided this wonderful symbol of not only the series, but of the ideas he's trying to capture. So I'm going to start, after that brief background about me, I'm going to start with a couple of images of wheels. Set a contrast up here. So there's one image. Stone wheel, pretty solid, no spokes. Rodney has spokes in his wheel, but pretty solid. I'm going to talk about this just in terms of how it visually represents a perspective. I'm going to say that represents an ethnocentric perspective, and I don't want to go there yet. But it's one that doesn't recognize a lot of difference, doesn't understand a lot of difference, pretty much has the view that everybody's like me and they should be like me. Okay? And then we'll go to Rodney's rendition, which is much more complex. Has the spokes, represents humanity, the endeavor, the exploration in a lot of different levels. Okay? Whoops, I got some more for you. So it's diverse and interconnected. Whoops, I don't want to go there yet. The perspective of this wheel is that the world, the universe, is a diverse and interconnected place. Spokes represent diversity or different cultural mediations of things. In my case today, different mediations of that individualness and collectiveness. But there's other ways to look at this wheel. And so one of the ways I want to look at it today, and I'll carry this wheel theme kind of throughout the talk, but we can see a hub, and I think Rodney might have talked about this before. We see a hub. We could take that hub as a common human core, as representing some type of humanity, some type of commonness that is based in some natural process. And I could talk about that, but I won't. And as I said, I see this tension between individualness and collectiveness as at that core. That whatever we produce as humans, culturally, community-wise, we need to negotiate that somehow. And there's lots of ways to do that. Cultures or cultural groups have developed many different ways to kind of formulate that tension and manage that tension. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The wheel could also, next slide, those were supposed to come in individually. But we got the common human core at the hub. We got the spokes, which are diverse cultural responses. We could take the wheel as representing one community. We could take the wheel as representing humanity. We could take the wheel as representing one individual, right? Because we all have all sorts of different pieces to us. Mostly I'm going to talk about, when I make reference to the wheel, I'm going to talk about it as one community, as kind of a representing a community. But it's also, I see it as in whole, as a symbol, as an image that carries lots of different layers of meaning and ideas. One of those being that it's a symbol of a common good. So if it's a representation of a community, it kind of shows how those pieces are held together and work together, conceivably for some common good. So my next slide, Rodney asked me to do this talk in August. And so you have to put together a title, right? So you put together a title that's broad enough so that you can pretty much develop a talk that fits under it. Well, my title, I believe, has me in a bit of a conundrum because I have to explain my title. And it's going to take some time. If you bear with me through the title and kind of explaining the components, I think it'll make a little more sense, and then we'll get back to some more wheels and talk about what those mean. So cultural imagination, which is, my title's gone, but it's part of my title. Basically, it's one of the ways that I talk about my approach. And there's two particular pieces to that. One is, it's an approach that looks at what is. It looks cross-culturally to understand the ways that humans have adapted, the ways that humans have built human community, and in this case, the ways that they've kind of negotiated, come up with a way to negotiate and manage this individualness and collectiveness. For me, in terms of methodology, it's primarily based on getting up and close and personal with people, listening to stories, studying history, doing some ethnography. I have other methodologies as well, but that's primarily what I've relied on. And then the next step for me is taking that information and subjecting it to some of my own analysis and theory. And for me, one of the things that I've always been interested in is trying to figure out from all this diversity, what are some of the commonalities we share? What are some of the common things we do as cultures in building community, as cultures in cultivating selves? But another sense, so that's looking at what is, another sense of the cultural imagination is looking at what could be. So based on what we learn by looking at different cultures, including ourselves, we can begin to think about what could be, okay? And even if something else should be, maybe not. But is there better ways that we can do things? Is there better ways that we can work towards common good? One of the ways that we can ponder that is through personal reflection. And this is sort of it is probably my primary learning outcome that I try to do when I teach. I'm working on a direct assessment for that. That's in progress. But nonetheless, one of the things I try to do is get students to understand that by looking at other cultures and even looking in depth at our own context, cultural context, we can begin to see ourselves in different light. We can see ourselves in a cultural context as products of that culture. We can see ourselves in a broader human context as products of that history. We can see one's own culture as something that's, rather than taken for granted, it's something that's dynamic and changing. It's something we can reflect on, something we can make decisions about whether there's something about it we should change. Not always easy to change, but we can. And we can think about other cultures as containing solutions or attempts or adaptations or resolutions. We can think of them as containing some wisdom, if you will, that we might learn from. Okay? So all of that is part of a reflection. The other piece of that, which I still have up there, is cultural critique. So that I was just talking about personal reflection. Now I want to talk about sort of a broader cultural critique where we can take, hopefully, what we've learned in our study and the theories we've built and turn it back on our own culture and develop a systematic cultural critique. Okay? That critique isn't necessarily bad, but it leads to an in-depth understanding of what we are and what we do, but also what we might do better. And as I said before, for me, the impetus has always been thinking about this common good. And what can we learn that might inform how we could do a common good better? Common good, of course, is something that's up for debate, right, in terms of what that actually means. But nonetheless, as a goal, it's always kind of driven what I do. In terms of cultural critique, I pretty much stick to home. I'm happy to critique where I come from, but I'm not too happy to critique other other cultures and other groups. So that was the cultural imagination. The other part, when I talk about individual self and community, I had a piece of this talk that kind of explained theoretically where I was coming from with this. And I shared this talk with someone very close to me who happens to be the Associate Dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences. And she said to me, that's really interesting, after I kind of delivered what I was going to say. And she said, I know you. I'm familiar with you talking like this, and it makes sense, but it's boring. And she said, those people there aren't going to know you. They're not going to be as familiar with your language and how you talk about things because they haven't heard it for 20 years, and it's going to be really boring. So I'm going to spare you that sort of theoretical background, but I do have to go one place with that. I have to go to the first part of my title, which is good enough, good enough. But suffice it to say for now that there is some theoretical foundation for claiming that this individual collectivism stuff might be at the center of what it means to be human and might be a primary issue in human communities. So quickly, good enough. This is the last really in-depth piece here. So good enough, I kind of adapted this concept from object relation psychoanalysis. And it's basically used, I'm going to probably reduce this so it's unrecognizable to them. But nonetheless, when they're talking about infant development, they're talking about the behavior of the primary caregiver. And the primary caregiver, in order to foster healthy individual development, must be a good enough mother. You can't be a bad mother, and you can't be a perfect mother. You have to be good enough. So you have to be responsive to the child's needs, right? So that the child feels, taken care of and some security. But you can't be so good that that child never develops a sense of other, a sense of being an individual in contrast with another, and in contrast with another that they're dependent on. So you have to be somehow a good enough, I'm not a mother or a primary caregiver, but you have to be a good enough primary caregiver so that you ease that child along and conceivably they develop, into a functioning individual that's tied and is attached and has some security with those around them. Okay? So if I do a classic psychological anthropology move and kind of take that and apply it to culture, then we can see that a culture has to do the same thing when it comes to managing this individualness and this collectiveness. It has to do it in such a way that this individualness isn't stifled, the creativity and agency isn't stifled, but that individual still remains connected to a group and learns how to behave in a way that group responds favorably. Okay? It learns that independence and that collectiveness. So that's one sense of good enough. That's the first phrase is good enough, good enough. So the first part is good enough. The second part returns to that cultural critique idea, wherein it's the more standard usage. Are we doing that good enough? Or does a particular cultural formula do that good enough? Does it manage that individualism and collectiveness good enough? So, is our good enough good enough? Are we doing that good enough in a good enough way today? Many authors would say we're not. We're not effectively balancing this tension of interest between the individual and the collective. And we're not effectively fostering a sense of community. And there's lots of people who talk about this, and one of the consistent themes is that this is a condition of modernity. I don't want to, another 5 minutes of my talk was talking about modernity, but I'm going to just assume you know what we're talking about there. One of the most interesting kind of takes on this talks about modernity sets the historical context, and then talks about our culture as in kind of, well, I won't go into too much detail. But anyway, just suffice it to say that this author says that one of the things that runs rampant in our culture is greed and self-interest and individualism. So this author says we're not managing that tension very well in a way that's sustainable, in a way that contributes as effectively as it could to the common good. Okay? So I'm just going to suggest that that may be the case. You may think otherwise. Another author goes on to say that the challenge that's in front of us is re-embedding ourselves into a sense of community, into an orientation and an understanding that we have a place, we have responsibilities, other people's interests matter to us. And I think that's the enduring problem of human community. So, let me catch up with my notes here. So I want to explore some examples. I think we can learn from history. I think we can learn cross-culturally. And I think we can turn that back on ourselves and think about what we could do better. Not to replicate something that we studied, not to replicate the past or replicate a different group, but to what we can learn from it in terms of developing perhaps a more effective management of these interests. Okay. Rodney said something about me talking about Butte all the time. If you ever took a class from me, I talk about Butte all the time. If you ever go have a drink with me, I'll probably end up talking about Butte, and you'll probably end up bored. But nonetheless, sticking with the wheel theme, where's the wheel in this picture?
It's at the top of the hoist.
It's top of the gallows frame. That's a wheel in Butte. When Rodney's teachers talked about wagon wheels, my teachers talked about the wheels on top of the Mountain Con mine, Butte, Montana. Copper mining town, not too far away. This whole picture says a million words, but I won't say a million words about it. But it does represent, looking at it, you can look at it a number of different ways, right? Today I'm going to look at it in one specific way and kind of take on this individualism, collectivism thing, creating a sense of community, and one aspect about how they did that. They did that in a lot of ways. But one I'm just going to focus on, because I think it really brings the problem to the fore. If you know anything about Butte now, it didn't bring the solution to the fore, at least long term. Okay? In context, for a period of time, particularly the period of time I was interested in, it worked perhaps good enough, in the second sense of good enough. Although that's arguable, and Butte's community, which I'm fascinated by obviously, was not perfect. In fact, they probably didn't perfect anything except pasties and povatizza, which are two of their foods. Don't tell my grandma this, but I'm not even sure they perfected those, because we've made some improvements, we think, but don't tell her. It's a big secret in our household. But it does show one of the ways that they mediated this, but it also demonstrates the cost of community, which is kind of an interesting idea. Community is not free. Community takes some investment. Community takes some sacrifice, which is an ongoing challenge, I think. When do I want to go to that slide is the question. One of the things that I want to just kind of, what I want to draw out about this is obviously the town was built on mining. After 1912 or so, the mining in Butte was pretty much controlled by one company. There was lots of conflict, lots of strife, lots of different ideologies floating around, lots of battles. But somewhere in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, Butte came up with their resolution. And what their resolution was pretty much comprehensive labor solidarity. And one of the ways they established that or handled that was by something I call the scab complex. Does everybody know what a scab is? Few people know what a scab is. Somebody tell me what a scab is. Adams? Georgia, tell us what a scab is.
Scab is a worker who crosses the picket line.
Okay, so if it's time to negotiate a contract and you can't come to terms with whoever's on the other side of the table, you go on strike. If while you're on strike, somebody goes to work in your place, that's scabbing in the general sense. Okay? In Butte, you did not scab. Well, some people did. But one of the ways they managed that was there was very severe social sanctions if you scabbed in Butte. The reason I bring this example up is because what's going on there? It's really some way to mediate this individualness and collectiveness towards a collective good. Someone scabbing, these stories are really sad. I mean, the people who felt the consequences of scabbing or felt compelled to go to work when there was a strike on, some really compelling stories. But in Butte, there was no sympathy for that. Because what they saw was somebody is going to work challenging my job and challenging my ability to take the current solution we have, which is to negotiate as a group for our salaries, and more important than salaries was safety. Safety and job security. Okay? You didn't scab in Butte. I have a quick story I got to tell. One of my cousins, great cousin, not great in the first sense, but great in the second sense. First cousin, or this cousin, in 1946, his dad, there was a strike in Butte, one of the biggest strikes there was. It was the last strike, I believe, although don't videotape this. I think it was the last one they had before they came up with some agreement where there could be a skeleton crew go into the mines and keep the mines from being flooded and stuff while they were on strike. This is the last strike where the union would allow people to do that. And my cousin's dad had worked his way up in the mines in Butte and become a foreman. And in 1946, he was asked to stay behind the fence while the workers went out on strike. And it was really gut-wrenching for them. And he had a meeting with the family, and they basically decided that he wasn't going to go out. Went and told his boss, I can't do it. I can't see my way to it because I have too many family, too many friends. Can't do it. So pretty violent strike, long strike. Strike's over. They go back to work. The company man calls in my cousin's father and says at noon, first day back to work, and says, "I got to let you go." He says, "What do you mean you got to let me go? Well, this is my whole life." And he said, "When I asked you to stay behind the fence, you didn't stay behind the fence, and the guys don't feel the same about you anymore. So you said that your family and friends were too important to do that. It's time for your family and friends to find you a job." He never worked again in the Butte mines. That was his whole trade. So that was part of the hardball there. That was part of the sacrifice. But he wouldn't have made a different decision otherwise, because the consequences were too much. I got a funny quote, or interesting quote. I don't know if it's funny. Oh, that's what he's told. So this is a story. I spent some time at the Retirees Club when I was in Butte, and I used to listen to their stories. This is one of the stories that two of them talked about one day. And about this whole thing of scabbing, it was not forgiven. Like, you didn't get over this in Butte, and you didn't get over this if you left Butte. So a lot of guys, boy, they just don't forgive. No, a friend of mine, he was a boss, and he scabbed. He said, "You know what? The biggest mistake I ever made in my life was staying behind the fence. You know what? You can go up to the M&M, which is classic Butte bar, recently reopened. If you go to Butte, go to the M&M. That's all I can say." Okay. Where am I? I walk in the M&M. First thing I got to do is fight or get my ass kicked all over the city of Butte. I can't go anywhere. And then the guy continues. He had to go out of town to do his drinking all the way up to West Yellowstone. And he says, "You know what?" He says, "I'll go up there and I'll have somebody from Butte say, 'Why, there's that scabby bastard.' He says, I got to get out of there also." He says, "Jesus Christ, even my old friends won't talk to me. Half of my family won't even talk to me." Those kind of stories were commonly retold. How often this actually happened, I don't know. But all I know is that part of the way that Butte maintained this solidarity was through telling these kind of stories and through holding to these kind of thoughts. The flip side of Butte was you could pretty much do anything else. I mean, really. There wasn't a whole lot else you could do in Butte that would get you socially ostracized other than scabbing. Second wheel. This isn't a wheel. But it's another historical example of the Lady of the Rockies. 90-foot tall statue built in Butte, put up on a 3,500-foot ridge, 1985, by a sky crane helicopter commandeered from the National Guard from Nevada. Came up, put this thing up there in 6 pieces. I'm getting to a wheel. This is the backside just to give you some perspective. This is a person right there. And when you come up to this thing, you come up behind it, up a road behind it, and then all of a sudden you see this statue, and it's really pretty awesome. There, my wheel. This is the foundation of the Lady of the Rockies. And if you look at Rodney's wheel and this wheel, and I'm going to show you one more image of a wheel, it's pretty complex. It doesn't have spokes, but it has rebar. That's all rebar. My uncle tied most of that rebar, if you listen to him. He was in charge of tying the rebar. But, you know, rebar is interesting. I mean, it's industrial. Whoever compared rebar to, like, anything metaphorical. But if you look at it like the spokes, it's all very intertwined. And it's relational. And each piece is tied in a particular way so that it reinforces the structure of that base. Massive. Anyway, that's the base. That's the sky crane helicopter. This is lifting the head on the statue in December 1985, after they almost dropped one piece. Okay? But just to reinforce the profundity of this base of the Lady of the Rockies in the history of human imagery, this is a mandala in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. See the similarities? Tibetan Buddhism, rebar. That's probably never been compared before, but now the point I want to make about this is this project, you can read that as I talk. This project was conceived by one person in Butte. 1979, his wife had colon cancer, and he prayed to Mary, and he said, "You do this for me, I'll build you a statue." 1979. 6 years later, this thing's as big as the Statue of Liberty. And it's 3,500 foot high on a mountain ridge that they had to build a road to get to. All volunteer supplies, all volunteer money. Huge community project. And if you read what Sister Jane, that's not her real name, said when I talked to her about it, I look at this as a project that would never have been accomplished without the entire community support and backing. And I think that's really what Butte has always been about. When we went on strike, they survived simply because the community got together and supported each other and cared for each other. And so with this project, I think that's the same spirit of Butte. Heard this over and over and over. But it really was a massive project, a massive community coming together to build the thing, taking the trades they learned in the mines for the construction work, taking their sense of helping each other out to raise the money. Okay, and they put this thing up there. And they got a sky crane helicopter from the National Guard, which is a whole other story. This is kind of funny too, because they view this thing as, even though some people might think it's a representation of Mary, and very Catholic at that, they don't view it that way. So here's a story about a donation, I'll let you read it, from a Jewish man, story told to me by Bob. Tim was one of Bob's friends, and Bob was telling me the story that Tim told him. More than likely true. 2 more examples to bring it home. I'm going to go through this one really quick just because I'm running out of time. I want to save some time if you have questions. Community at the University of Idaho. What do you think I got that up there for? Vandal sports? Nah. Noon ball. Can't get surprised. This is certainly, as it turns out, it's not necessarily by design, but as it turns out, because we live in the culture we live in, certainly a gendered example, and lots of issues with that. But it's a group of people who play basketball at noon on the University of Idaho campus. In fact, Tuesday is my day to play. I'm missing that. But they've been doing this for decades. It's very important to them. I've met lots of people playing noon ball. Not always in the most favorable terms, but for the most part, favorable. David Siegler is going to start playing noon ball. but over time, especially the last 3 or 4 years, they play in Mem Gym, and the time that they've been allotted in Mem Gym has kind of been shrunk and threatened. So recently, I have some quotes, but I don't want to share them because I haven't asked people if I can share them. But recently, there was a flurry of emails in defense of Noomball, and it was all about this community stuff. It was really pretty interesting, going back historically about how long they've played and how many people they've met and what kind of environment it is. It's not always pleasant, believe me, but for the most part, it is, and they really kind of came to the fore to talk about it in those terms. I don't know if that's going to be successful. I hope it is, but it was a pretty interesting example of one of those sort of, I don't want to say underground, but kind of unseen communities and how people really feel that way about it. Okay. Another, I got to give some props to one person. Aaron Thomas. Anybody know Aaron Thomas? Professor of chemical engineering. Awesome basketball player. Love to play with Aaron Thomas on his team. And the reason this is just an anecdote, but the reason I really like to play with Aaron Thomas, because he's the kind of person that makes everybody on his team better. You don't always see that at Noomball, right? You have a bunch of people, you have a lot of folks out there that are just, kind of sort of wanting to show how good they are or not. But Aaron Thomas is the kind of person that's always watching and always looking to see how he can make his players better. I just love playing with him. That's like a side note of sort of an attitude. I've always admired that in sports and in baseball in particular, but Aaron is just the epitome of that. So props to Aaron. One last example. I'm going to take 5 minutes and talk about this, and then I'll be done, I think. Catch up with my notes. So the 3 examples I told you, the historical examples and the Noomball example, are kind of things, expressions of community that just sort of emerged given the context, right? Couldn't have built the Lake of the Rockies in too many places, I don't think, the way that they did it. Kind of a lot of things came together. There was sort of a crisis. They got together. The mines had shut down, and they had all the right stuff there to do that. It just kind of happened. They didn't set out to, what can we do to kind of pull this community together? Let's have a community project. Let's have a service project or something. They didn't do that. It just happened. But I think one of the challenges we face today is, if we do think this is a problem, or even if we don't like the word problem, if we think that we could use more of it, how do we go about doing it? And I think partially it has to be more intentional. And not in the little Disney developments where they have these planned communities. Not in that sense, although that's not, that type of process might be a piece of it. But I think in terms of thinking personally, how do we manage this individual collective thing? How do we do that? In all the examples I know, it's been done culturally. And it's been done through stories and cultural narratives, where sort of moral principles and values are set. Okay? The next example is not necessarily to that degree, but it is an attempt on campus with my fellow Humanities fellows from 2010, 9 or 10, Tracy Craig and Sean Quinlan from History, Tracy's in Psychology. We were appointed as Humanities Fellows, which is not the Distinguished Humanities Fellow, but nonetheless it's sort of like a junior minor league, Humanities Fellows. And we decided, we were kind of given the topic of community, but we decided what can we do to help build community on campus? And so we sort of invented this title, Human Communities Research Consortium, that has not been approved by Jack MacGyver or whoever has to approve new centers and stuff. It's just kind of a word. And we put together a program that kind of started with a retreat. So one of the common goals among professors is that we have scholarship obligations, and we want to do scholarship. One of the challenges is we don't often have time to do it. Especially in our college where we have high teaching loads, we don't always have time to do it. And once you get out of doing it, it's really hard to get back in. It's really hard to make yourself get that time to get back started doing it. So we developed a retreat. We asked people to submit applications, projects that were unfinished, and we asked them to be at this retreat for writing. It was a week-long retreat. We did a couple of things. We put them in triads, first of all, Tracy Craig's a social psychologist, and you got to have triads. Dyads don't work, and quads don't work. You got to have a triad. So we put them in triads. They shared papers. They edited papers. They worked on papers. They shared them again and edited them. And then hopefully by the end of the week, if the papers weren't done, they were really close. And then we followed that up with a workshop series during the school year where these same people submitted either a new paper or the same paper to a group of people who read it and then showed up at the workshop meeting, which is every other week. And the workshop meeting wasn't a presentation. The author would talk for 5 minutes about the status of the paper, and the rest of us would talk for 55 minutes about what you need to do to fix it. Pretty intensive interaction. Lots of expectations on the participants, because you had to read and edit this paper and be prepared to talk about it. But we hoped that a lot of benefits in the process. So the retreat, we worked on papers. We also talked about the writing process. We read books and we talked about the challenges and talked about ideas. We also had little sessions where we talked about some of the other challenges, like how do you write a book proposal? You know, how do you write a grant proposal and those kind of things, and we shared some ideas. And we also had some refreshments and some barbecues, and we did this off campus. So I think there was some, part of our idea, our intent, because this was intentional, was to sort of build a sense of togetherness. Did we do that good enough? I don't know. Did we make any progress in kind of trying to balance? Scholarship in the U.S. Academy is a really individual behavior, or really individual organization. You're in class and you're not, for the most part, probably doing group assignments, or you're not being assessed collectively. You're being assessed individually. When you go to grad school, you're going to compete with other students. When you go on the job market, you're going to compete with other people. When you go to do research and publish, you're competing with other people. The whole structure of it isn't necessarily a collaborative one. Isn't necessarily one that builds community. Not that it doesn't happen, but we thought it could happen better, and we were trying to do this with this program. Okay? Those are my examples. I'm going to give you a real quick conclusion because I talked longer than I wanted to. So the problem or the problematic of human community, we talked a little bit about the cultural imagination and building community, the need to culturally mediate the individualness and collectiveness. Communities today may have to have more of an intentional component than they have in the past. Not that they've never had that in the past. I think they need to be made plausible. You have to build a structure around them. Part of the challenges with our Human Communities Research Consortium is people's time. We haven't reorganized anything else, and we're asking them to do something new. We're asking them to commit, and that's a real challenge. It's a challenge for this program. It's a challenge for all of us. And so part of it is we haven't done enough to create a plausible sort of context for it to happen. I also think there needs to be, there has to be stories. You could call them myth. I like to use the word myth, not in a false sense, but just in a word for narrative that kind of reinforces these values and these practices. And there's lots of spokes and traditions that one could root those in or draw from. Finally, I'll leave you with the question, is good enough good enough? Is our good enough good enough? Thank you for your patience. Thanks for coming. So, questions, comments? Yes?
Do you think that this sort of community model of standing together is still feasible at a larger scale?
Standing together in what sense?
Like, you gave an example of the miners on strike and stuff, and multiple examples of communities voicing together and sort of having more power than individual.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely still possible. I think there's more challenges today, and there's lots of reasons for that. You know, specifically about labor, it's much more challenging. What happened in Butte was they found a way to control the local labor market. And when that local labor market, it was never as local as they thought, but when that market expanded and other strategies were taken by the companies, they no longer had control, and that's what happened. There's still more copper ore in Butte than there is in any other major deposit, and vastly more than they ever took out. But there is a mine open there, but it's a much smaller operation. In terms of standing collectively as a community to do other things, absolutely. People are doing it all over the world. You know, we can talk about maybe their ends, but because those are different, right? Those are always up for debate. But absolutely, people are doing it. Yeah, I think it's challenging though. There's lots of competing avenues.
I guess I was amazed by the Lady of the Rockies example because that was a small community doing this amazing thing.
Yeah.
Just imagining if the whole nation worked together like that.
Yeah.
What they could do.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty inspiring, but I think it's lost. Even the inspiration of it all is lost in Butte sometimes. I mean, it's pretty awesome. I'm just amazed when I think about that. But could that happen? I mean, that was so many different perfect things that came together, including a crisis to make that happen, including a mine that shut down and had steel laying all over the place, and diesel fuel from trucks that they were selling to mines in Arizona that they gave to, you know, all sorts of stuff that came together for that. But it, you know, as a model, I think it's pretty interesting. Yes?
Which high school did you go to?
I didn't actually go to high school in Butte. I would have went to Butte High, though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Did you? Are you from Butte?
My family is.
What's your last name?
Mine's McCormick, but Shiner decides for that.
Okay. I'll look you up. Yeah. Stefan.
A bit of the curmudgeon or something to this question that is, I mean, you well know that community has its costs, right? And you pointed out some of the costs that once the community forms with certain degrees of cohesion,
Right.
it's formed through disciplinary force.
Right.
At different levels.
Absolutely.
And I wondered how the Lady of the Rockies, from that point of view, appears to you both in its cultural and religious dimensions, or even in terms of the way it might seem to bless this community and its endeavors, which in itself, from some other perspective on energy, there might be a different point of view.
Well, there's lots of different points of view, right? And it was quite controversial, actually, when the idea was first hatched. Butte's, I mean, it looks Catholic, right? So anybody who either is Catholic or doesn't like Catholic sees Catholic. Most other people probably see Catholic. As it turns out, the whole mission is non-denominational, and they actually have a memorial up there to mothers, and it's talked about as a memorial to mothers, which in and of itself is problematic, right? It's reducing womanhood to being that particular role, and it's sort of, so there's lots of problematic things. It is Catholic. If it's not Catholic, it's certainly Christian, or Mary was a Jewish girl. It's at least within that realm of tradition, right? And so it's exclusive. Some people think it's ugly as heck. I mean, some people thought it really defaced the ridge. The ridge is pretty awesome, and yeah, now you have a notch cut out and a big white thing up there that you can't really tell what it is because it's so high.
It's like the Eiffel Tower, I mean, everything gets oriented around it once it's erected.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know if I'm getting your question, Stefan, but definitely there's different perspectives on that.
I'm just trying to recognize that even in the very moments towards cohesion, which
There's
is very
cost.
productive and necessary to community, there are, in that same movement, exchange value costs.
Yeah, and that's another thing that...
This community is devoted to mining, it's not devoting its energies to another form
Yep.
of productivity in terms of economic.
And that was part of the debate, right? It was a time when the mines had shut down. People were out of work. I mean, they were really struggling, but yet people were donating to build this, and that was an open debate about couldn't we be using. I mean, there's no cost on it. It was estimated, a couple $1 million or whatever.
I mean,
But yeah, I mean, and a lot of energy is going towards that. When perhaps something else could have been done, that was talked about. But communities they do have costs. They have costs in your participation, but they also have costs because they become very exclusive, right? And they're also set off against an other, which, as we know, is sort of a human story of conflict, and you have to negotiate that.
That kind of leads into an interesting question, and you are free not to answer this one. This is almost a David Adler or Dean Burnett question dealing with Constitution. But this is just an interesting feed-in between the current political debate nationally for president, between one hand individualism versus collectivism, and that tension is part of our democracy, part of our,
Right.
part of our constitution.
Right.
It's South out today. And
Right. It is part of our Constitution and it's part of our history because there's all sorts of, within the U.S., all sorts of cultural ideas about how to deal with individualism and collectivism or individualness and collectiveness. And many of those ideas are no longer with us. Or they get resurrected once in a while in a history class or one of George's classes. You know, but there's a lot of those ideas. And as you know, with your familiarity with the traditions you're familiar with, those have been, well, I think it's pretty safe to say, all but excluded from this whole U.S. Americanism, this whole development of this culture. And see, you asked me a question, and I know I didn't get your question, but I talked about something. Carmen.
I'm always interested in what some would call deviance and aberration. So the concept of community, where community gets completely stunted because there is no common good except that which maybe the few coming from an urban environment. I think of certain neighborhoods that live in harder than that because of communities unto themselves. But
Right.
it's fear and domination and those things. And
Right.
often that human conflict may eventually change it.
Right.
But I'm sure other places, small towns, other kinds of communities, because that interests me how it can go to the aberrant side.
Well, okay. Let me just talk from sort of an anthropological lens here. When we say it's aberrant against some standard, right? And it has its goals and purposes, and we may not like those, but they're there, right? And in and of themselves, they're at least working temporarily. So it's interesting that the same kind of they're working towards those ends. Yeah, yeah, the structure is working. So it's interesting how it works. The ends is another discussion about what are we as a country or as a community, and what ends, what groups exist, and how are they using these principles to work towards what ends, and what do we think about that? And we see that in national debates, right? Communities can get very closed in. They can get very, that's part of the nature of them, right? Is to become defined, and they can get ever more tightly defined and restricted. And that's part of the challenge. But yeah, that's human conflict is largely about that. Yeah.
It seems to me that the discussion is dancing around the issue well, I don't know, is this a Marxist critique in some ways? Could it be easily, because we're talking about all the stuff, but we're really not talking about it directly. We're talking about labor, we're talking about modernity, which is the capitalism.
Right. I think that's part of it. I think that's part of the challenge we face, right? I think that the challenge of our current economic structure is really a problem that we have to face. And if for no other reason, that we're likely on path to cause some very severe environmental destruction, which is probably not good for the species. Whatever, it doesn't have to be a Marxist critique per se. It's what are we doing? What values are we operating by? Is this sense of individualism so much a part of that system that we've lost track of any responsibility or any connectedness? And is it leading to a path that science tells us is probably not a good one, right? At least environmentally. So I don't think I also don't think it's Marxist in the sense, that's certainly there. I won't deny that. That's certainly, I wouldn't say it's just exclusively Marxist, but that idea of critiquing our economic system, our current economic system, is certainly part of what we have to ask ourselves. And I think people are. But there's also questions just about what makes us human. What gives us meaning and purpose, right? And that's not all about economics. And a large part of that is wrapped up in this community and wrapped up in negotiating this, what I claim is part of our essence, which is individualness and collectiveness. I think most people can relate to the pleasures of being collective. And if we and the rewards, as well as the sacrifices, but even sacrifices, as we know from human history, can be perceived as, or at least experienced as, very satisfying. And so I think there's that piece of it that's part of our humanity that we're that I'm interested in as well as, and that's one of the things I confronted and imbued in my research was there was this clear sort of economic piece, which I wrote about, and then there was this, it's not another piece, but a related piece was this kind of humanist, I hesitate to use the word religion, but it's basically what it was, but is what did they do on the ground? Not just Catholic, but how did they infuse these lives with meaning? And they had tons of ways to do so, and I was fascinated in how they did that. So I think it's all part and parcel of the questions we can ask. Lumel.
I think that in this culture, I mean American culture, is that I think that people become start embracing collectivism when they are under pressure, and usually it's the economic pressure. You know,
Yes.
Begins, or these days, or in this century, it's the environmental pressures.
Right.
So then people, start building communities around those issues.
Right. A perceived threat can do that, right?
What?
A perceived threat can really do that, or a crisis. And I think that's part of our politics, is there's perceived threats out there that people are organizing around, which we don't always agree the same threat is there, but yes.
But it is a real threat.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a real assault
Yeah.
on, on our well-being.
Right.
We do have an artificial threat right now in that timing.
I-
But please, if you have additional questions for John, please come forward, and thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.